Yep, there you go.
Good afternoon. It's so good to see all of you as residents here in Monte Vista Groves here in the...
I think you got to talk right into.
Swap them out. Let's try this again. How's that? We good, Oscar? Okay. It's so great to see all of you here as residents of Monte Vista Groves, and we welcome those of you who are attending online. This is going to be an absolutely delightful afternoon. The best part of living at Monte Vista Grove are getting to know the wonderful people that are here. And we all have taken different roads to get to this place, but they've all intersected here at the Grove. And we have the privilege of living in community here. So this afternoon, we get to hear the stories of folks that have just recently joined us. Liz Cheadle and Judy and Tom Durff have recently moved into their places here on campus, finally, and renovated, and you're in. and we're just so glad to have them here. And when I say we've all taken different roads to get here, we're going to hear about 3 different roads that have brought these 3 friends here to the campus in Pasadena. So Liz, why don't we start with you? Your road starts a long time ago with someone who was very significant in Presbyterian history. So start there and tell us a little bit about that.
First, I'm so honored to be here, and thank you all for coming out in the rain to hear our stories. It's been delightful to be able to meet people in the last several weeks, and I feel very blessed. I feel very blessed to be here. And just raise your hand if I start lowering my voice at all. So Terry was alluding to the fact that I am a 12th generation descendant of a guy named Richard Denton, who in 1630 came with John Winthrop on the good ship Arabella to the New World. He was a pastor in England at a place called Coley Chapel, and was a Presbyterian. And he came over and started being an itinerant preacher, and ultimately settled a church in Hempstead, New York, in Long Island. That was not the first Presbyterian church in the country, but it was one of the first handful. And many historians and genealogists, including, of course, my grandmother, who was deeply invested in this, think that he was, in fact, the first Presbyterian minister to come to the New World. And I've seen quotes from Cotton Mathers talking about what a good preacher he was. He moved all around New England, and I was always told these stories when I was growing up, although for whatever reason, my parents were members of the Congregational Church in Sierra Madre, and that's where I was baptized and went to Sunday school and would play the church organ at 5 o'clock a couple of evenings a week so that all the kids around town could hear it and know that it was time to go home for dinner. So it wasn't until my late 40s, after I'd been away from church for longer than I'd like to admit, that I became a Presbyterian myself. But that's how far my lineage goes back with that. So I was born and raised in Sierra Madre. I went to Woodrow Wilson Junior High School down the street, graduated from Pasadena High School, and then moved west to go to UCLA, where I did both my undergraduate work and went to law school. I went to law school after being a paralegal for a couple of years because I seemed to have an aptitude for it, and I couldn't think of anything else to do. And I loved law. I liked law school a lot, and I didn't know what I was going to do, but I had the fabulous fortune to get a job for 2 years after law school with a federal judge named Harry Pragerson, who served on the United States Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit. And he was a living saint. And he taught me and all the law clerks that law was a toolbox that could and should absolutely be used as a force of good. And we used to say when we were working for him that he kind of ruined our ability ever to be in private practice because it was just so rewarding to do good things. And one example I can give of him, I became pregnant with my first child the first year I was clerking for him, and he came to realize that there was no childcare in downtown Los Angeles for government workers who had babies. And he was outraged by that. So he didn't just solve my problem, and he did solve my problem. Bring the baby to work, we'll decorate, you can have my parking space, all of that. He called up Mayor Bradley and said, "Tom, do you realize there's no childcare in downtown LA? That's an outrage, we need to do something." And he badgered Bradley until a childcare center was put in City Hall shortly after that. And then he got himself on the task force that was planning a new federal courthouse, and he made sure that that federal courthouse, now the Roy Ball building, had a child care center available to government workers. So he taught me that when you see a problem, you don't necessarily just fix the problem for one person, you try to solve it for as many people as you can. And that was an incredible lesson. And I went on to spend 3 years at a private law firm, and that really reinforced for me that I didn't want to do that. I learned a lot, but I didn't want to do that. And then I was able to sort of jump at the opportunity to become the district office director for a state legislator, state assembly member, who had himself been a public interest lawyer as executive director of an agency called Betzedek Legal Services, which was started in the Jewish community to help Holocaust survivors obtain their benefits. So he said, "I'm a public interest legislator," and he was successful at banning smoking in public buildings in California. I was able to work with him on legislative hearings to preserve funding during a Republican administration for family planning back in, this is the 1980s, and work on environmental protection measures, particularly for a state agency called the Santa Monica Mountains Conservancy. The Santa Monica Mountains Conservancy then offered me a job full-time as their in-house counsel, which I took excitedly, thinking, now I can use that real estate stuff that I learned in private practice. And to be able to go out and preserve open space and then make it accessible to all people and figure out ways to create access was just so rewarding. And one of the deals that I worked on was the Synod of Southern California and Hawaii had owned in Pacific Palisades a conference ground that they'd purchased from the Methodists at some point. But there had been all kinds of plans to expand it. The community was opposed to that, and the Synod ran out of money. But the Conservancy obtained funding that they could use to acquire lands that would be used for access for at-risk kids. So we were able to acquire that conference ground and then watch that readaptive reuse of property that had been used by the Presbyterians to create science camp for school children around the LA area who'd never been outdoors, never seen a beach, never heard an owl. So that was really incredibly rewarding for me. And then out of the blue, I was invited to apply to become Dean of Students at UCLA Law School. And I ended up spending the last 20 years of my career there, although I was also appointed to the board, the governing board of the Santa Monica Mountains Conservancy, so at nights I could go to their meetings and continue with that work, which was really rewarding. And my time at UCLA Law School, I'd never needed to go to see a dean of students, but I found that there's a whole, students have problems, and they have to go see a dean, And, you know, particularly at a secular institution that doesn't have a chaplaincy program, they have to go, the dean of students is it. That's the person you can go to. So I could help solve certain problems. And what and these were days when I had not been going to church. But I saw faith in so many of my students, and they really reflected it back at me. And I would get notes sometimes from students saying, "You were the angel that God sent to help me through this particularly difficult situation." And that really touched my heart. And I could see how they relied on their faith. And at the same time, I was going through a transition in my own life at the end of a 23-year marriage. And I was re-examining what has been important in my life to me, and what do I want to have my life be going forward. And so I'd seen Brentwood Presbyterian Church. I believe I was there with my grandmother at a Palm Sunday service as a child. And I knew of some people who went there. But one Sunday morning, my Sunday routine was watch Meet the Press, read the New York Times, and drink my coffee. And I looked at the clock and said, "Church starts in a half hour. You can do this." And I threw some clothes on, went to Brentwood, and they were doing a whole sermon series on welcoming. They had actually laid down a red carpet that day to show that they would use red carpets for to welcome. I looked around. One of my former students was there and welcomed me. I saw somebody else I knew. And at the end of the service, I said, this is my church. This is it. And so I took the next members class, jumped into as many things as, I'd scour the bulletin. What can I do? Where can I go? Let's go build houses in Mexico. Great. The next year, a team of people went to Cameroon to establish a faith relationship with them. And I was on session within, I want to say, a year and a half. The church itself was going through transition, and I think there were so many people who had put themselves in one corner or another that it was helpful to have someone who had come in recently and could see things differently. So I have been, I was clerk of session. I've served on session a couple of times, been a deacon, in addition to Cameroon and Mexico, have gone to Nicaragua, to Bluefields, and then served on committee on ministry for 6 years after I went off session. And it's just become such an important part of my life. And, I wish I had been doing this all my life. But I think it is even more precious to me that I was away from the church for a while and then was able to come back. So I think I've taken my 15 minutes of fame.
There are ways in which your legal training in law intersected with your ministry at Brentwood. You were on committee on ministry, several investigative commissions. You don't need to go into the details on that, but talk a little bit about how did your legal training help you navigate some really, really difficult issues that several churches were facing?
Yeah, I think legal training is really helpful and perhaps especially with sort of the Presbyterian polity where you have to go, we have a book of order, for God's sake, we have these rules and to interpret them and apply them. There were two different investigating committees that I was on where it was sort of mimicking a court of law in terms of evaluating testimony and evidence and what do we believe and what do we not believe. And I think that was, my legal background was really helpful for that. And then also, this is kind of back in 2006, there were 2 women, one of whom is an ordained Presbyterian minister, who wanted to have a service of blessing at Brentwood Church. Not a marriage, service of blessing. And they had 2 small children who really wanted to see that happen too. And there were some spies from another church who came and videotaped everything and came up with this complaint against the church, the session, the pastors, because there was a ring, there was a kiss, there were flower girls, and they accused the church and the pastors in the session of doing an illegal marriage. I was clerk of session. The assistant clerk was at that time a partner at Latham, the law firm of Latham and Watkins. And we kind of laughed about it. They said, who do they think they're picking on, that they've got these 2 lawyers? So we used our legal skills, and that went away. But that's, the legal train's an important tool, and it can be used in really good ways.
Well, thank you, Liz. I'm sure there'll be more questions along the way. So your story begins with the Arabella a long time ago. Judy, your story starts in Mississippi, so pick it up there and take it and run with it.
Well, first let me say how delighted I am to be here, and just to hear, Liz, your story. I mean, it's fascinating, it's inspiring, just as so many of the stories are that I've already heard here, and look forward to hearing more. Yeah, I started in Mississippi, honey, and grew up there. My mother was a real Southerner. My father was from Wisconsin, so I think that had an effect on my Southern drawl. But I don't think I knew really, I did not recognize the ocean I was swimming in until I got out of it. Like the fish who goes to the older fish and says, where's the water? I keep hearing about water. So there was a lot of unlearning that I think I had to do beginning in college. Went to Rhodes College, which is a lot like Occidental College that some of you may know. It's in Memphis, and that changed my life in a variety of ways, not the least of which is the gentleman sitting to my left, and he can tell you some of that story. It wasn't until 5 years later that I convinced him that we should get married. Where do I say? I never imagined myself being a Presbyterian pastor, okay? This was not part of my plan. Tom and I were married in 1967 and came to California, and then came back to live here, we thought, for a couple of years in 1968. He would be practicing law, and I would start looking for work. And at that time, I could not find a job that interested me at all because I did not want to be a secretary or a teacher, and had given up journalism as a possibility of a career for a variety of reasons, which I won't discuss now. But so I got a job working for an insurance company, and ultimately, that led to work at Hughes Aircraft Company out near the airport, where I was an assistant manager of all things environmental health and safety. But I was doing that because of the work that I had done in the insurance field in workers' compensation. So I was basically a liaison between our Hughes self-insurance company and all of the safety engineers at the 12 locations. So it was interesting. But I left that job after we had children. I was fortunate enough to be able to stay home with 2 children. When both children were in elementary school, right over here at Polytechnic School in Pasadena, we lived at that time in La Cañada. I decided that it was finally time for me to figure out what my call was in life, what I really wanted. I felt like I had not had the career that I wanted to have and was in some ways supposed to have. So I did what a lot of people, I think, did at that time. I read that book, What Color is Your Rainbow? Anybody read that a long time ago? Or What Color is Your Parachute? Sorry, What Color is Your Parachute? Did some testing. And at the same time, I had been away from church. Perhaps I should just jump back to Mississippi and say that my mother was a Southern Baptist. My father was a Roman Catholic. They decided that I would decide for myself when I would be baptized and what church I would go to. This was actually good training. I have counseled many parents, don't do this. But at 12, because a neighbor invited me to go with her children to the local Presbyterian church in Vicksburg, Mississippi, I went, and at 12 was baptized. So at this time in my life, with 2 children in school in my early 40s, I decided, I'd periodically gone to church, but I decided it was time for me to go back and figure out what I really believed and how much this faith that I professed mattered to me. So I did that. And I was invited to be in a women's group after the pastor's Bible study. Gary Demarest, whom you all know and I hope love as much as I do, was the pastor of that church. So I went to his Wednesday morning Bible study and ended up in a women's group. And the reason I mentioned them is they prayed like nobody I had ever experienced, praying to a very personal God with all kinds of issues. So when I couldn't figure out, after all the testing I'd done, what I should be doing with my life, I thought, aha, maybe I should pray about this. Big mistake. Make certain you're ready to hear from God if you decide to pray about an important decision, because I think God answers those prayers. I had what I would call a rather mystical experience and really felt that when I prayed, I was being told, go to seminary, become a pastor. Now, this was really startling to me. I had not planned on anything like this. And I argued with God for about a month. And I finally went to a counselor and to that same small group and talked about this. Well, the small group thought it was really good news. And I thought, well, for Pete's sake, why do you think that's good news? This scares the devil out of me. Anyway, I ended up being told, go talk to each of the pastors in this church. I did that. I eventually, a few months later, started Fuller Seminary. And at that time, Tom said, if this is what you think you need to do, then yes, we'll support you. And maybe you'll tell, or shall I tell a little bit of that story?
I can do it.
You can do it, okay.
I will cover myself.
Tom and I had some very interesting years while we were both back in school. And it was a little bit difficult at our house. We had 4 students. I'll leave it at that. But I graduated from Fuller and was called to the Lafayette Presbyterian Church and was thrilled with that. But I think I need to go back and tell you why one of the major factors in the ministry that I began to undertake at Lafayette Press and then continued at Lafayette Orinda Presbyterian in the East Bay of San Francisco. During my time in seminary, a question came up for me, and I will tell you, because you will hear this part of the story from Tom, that question was whether or not I could go ahead and finish seminary and become a pastor if I was going to end up as a divorced woman. I felt that I knew the answer to that question, that I definitely was on this path, I was called to it, and that was what I wanted. But I wanted God's answer, not my answer. So I put out a call. I had a friend who said that she knew a spiritual director who would lead something called a discernment group for me. And so a group of, I believe it was 6 women, and this wonderful spiritual director and I started meeting together. Our first meeting was at 6 a.m. on Sunday morning because I wanted people who were really committed to this process. And we spent about 6 months engaging in various discernment processes to see if together as a community we could discover what God's true leading was in my life. These women and this spiritual director gave me their time and their focus, and it was an incredible gift of learning a lot of different practices in which we can engage to actually experience the movement of the Spirit and God's call in our life and be fairly assured of it. You know, but always, I think with God, you have to test things out. You take the journey, you take the step, and it's after you've done that that you look back and you go, yeah, this was right. Or no, this wasn't quite right. Maybe I need to do something else. But that was very formative in my moving into what we then called spiritual formation and spiritual guidance and spiritual direction as my ministry in the church. It seemed to me that too much of Presbyterian churches, and let me pause to say that yes, we need to do business, and yes, we do have legal battles, and yes, we do need to handle those, but at the same time, we need to do our business as people who are trying to follow Jesus Christ. And there are a variety of ways to do that. But for me, I felt like too much of the time we ended up in Presbyterian churches doing business, because a lot of them have a lot of wonderful people who are trained in the corporate field, and the deal is get the business done. And yes, we have to get our business done, but we can find ways to do that and try to listen to God. So I have continued with that ministry, and in 2000 went to San Anselmo, to San Francisco Theological Seminary, to actually be trained as a spiritual director, and that was a program that went over a period of 3 years, and that, of course, was very helpful and meaningful to me. That's been my ministry. I continue to work in the field of spiritual guidance and spiritual direction. When I retired from Lafayette Orinda Presbyterian Church, I went to work. I didn't go to work for, but my plan was, and what I wanted to do was to take pastors on spiritual journeys without going places. I mean, just on retreats and in spiritual guidance groups. And so I worked with the Presbytery of San Francisco to offer to pastors in that presbytery spiritual guidance groups. And I organized a group of other spiritual directors to work with me in that, and created that program to nurture pastors, because I think pastors desperately need to be spiritually nurtured. And that was a very rewarding and interesting ministry to me. So I guess that's pretty much my journey.
There's one other piece that you've talked about in several conversations with some of us. After you retired from Lafayette Orinda, you got involved in an RCA church in Oakland. And when you speak about that, there's such a deep appreciation for what you experienced there. Judy, just describe some of what was going on and what is going on in that church in Oakland.
Okay. This was, Tom and I went looking for a church after, when a pastor leaves a church, you need to move on. And we tried a lot of different churches, from Quakers to Episcopal to congregational, just a variety around the Bay Area, trying to find a place that felt like home. Walked into this little, actually it's about a 1903 building that was originally a Presbyterian church in Fruitvale in Oakland, Fruitvale area of Oakland. Because a friend said, I'd try, Josh McPaul's church. He was a Presbyterian pastor that came out of First Pres Berkeley. Walked in there. He had formed that church with a black Baptist street preacher because they wanted to create a church in which particularly white, Hispanic, and black residents of Oakland could come together. Walked in, sat down in this little old building that had a variety of different people trying to worship together. And before the end of the service, I was in tears. I cry easily. And my husband looked at me and said, well, I guess we found our home, right? So indeed we had. And it wasn't too long after that some questions arose within the church about the acceptance of homosexuals in leadership in that church, queer people in that church. And so I ended up working with the elders in a discernment process to help them make that decision. We took several months to work through that. This was, you mentioned this, Terry, I guess I should say, this was a Reformed church in America congregation, but with a Presbyterian pastor. So we were a very mixed group of people. That experience for both of us was extremely meaningful and educational because we were learning to live in a community with a great deal of diversity. And when you do this, one of the sermons we both remember is that the pastor said, this is going to be awkward. You are going to say the wrong thing. And you are going to have to ask for forgiveness. And the same thing's going to happen. Somebody's going to have to ask for your forgiveness. And it was. There were awkward moments. I didn't realize what it might mean for a white former Southerner to bring to the first community meal that we had, which was a fish fry being put on by the black community. And what do I bring? I brought greens and cornbread because I thought that was what one would have, okay? I mean, all of a sudden I'm sitting there and I realized, looking around the room, what audacity, what an awkward thing I have done. White woman bringing black soul food to the black celebration. Anyway, I had to apologize for that, and they were very kind to me. But I do make good cornbread and greens.
One of the black women said, those greens are as tender as a mother's love. And so they loved them. She's downplaying it.
But that's what's so meaningful to the two of us, to be able to live and worship in a community of diversity and to be taken in. It was really beautiful and wonderful. That pastor ended up going back to Australia. Shame on him. And I worked then for about 9 months with the session, not as an interim pastor, but in helping the session by moderating that session and helping them navigate this huge transition and set up a call committee and do a search and those kind of things. But those, what was it, 7 years? 7 years in that church were particularly meaningful to both of us and very eye-opening. And we would love to find a similar church here.
Thanks for sharing that part of the story as well. Tom, your road starts in Memphis, and you learned some very important lessons there working in your family business and have made the journey here. So take us down your road.
Okay. Yes, born and raised in Memphis, Tennessee, in fact, South Memphis, a very working class neighborhood. This was during the days of not only cultural segregation, but I mean legal segregation, separate school systems, separate restaurants. My father owned a service station. At first it was Pan Am, and then it became Amoco, I think. But his original station had 4 bathrooms, black men and women, or actually what were called then colored men and women, and white men and women. His service station was on one of the borderlines. Black people could live here, white people live here, but because it was on the borderline street, both black people and whites traded at the station. So we learned very early on from my mother that the N-word was not permitted in our household because the food on the table, our income, my dad's livelihood depended on both black customers and white customers. And I think this put us in kind of an unusual position in Memphis in those days. I've often wondered if maybe there were people who perhaps looked down on us because we served black people. It was a full service station. The customer pulls in, you go out, pump the gas, clean the windshield, check the air in the tires, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And we did that for both black customers and white customers. So that was kind of a formative thing in a very racist society at that point in time. I was raised in a local Methodist church, was active in the MYF, the Methodist Youth Fellowship, through high school. I went to, as Judy mentioned, Rhodes College in Memphis because I was fortunate enough to receive a full scholarship, and really didn't know anything about college. I was the first one in my family to go to college. But in September of 1962, everything changed because 19-year-old me saw 18-year-old Judy walking out of the doors of Palmer Hall on the campus of what was then known as Southwestern at Memphis. Now it's known as Rhodes College. And we have been together ever since. And so that was 60 years as of last September. It took us 5 years to get married because I said we didn't have money, and we were both still getting our educations. But I finished at Rhodes and had decided I wanted to become a lawyer, went up to the University of Virginia in Charlottesville, Virginia. Judy joined me there. She was studying international studies at the Woodrow Wilson School and had an opportunity for a summer job in California. I took that opportunity. We got married. Our honeymoon consisted of driving to Los Angeles so could begin to earn some money.
5 nights on the road. Get there
Yeah.
as quick as you can.
Yeah, it was pedal to the metal. We wanted to get out of here. Anyhow, interesting little twist. One of the partners in the firm that summer was going to be gone a great deal and wanted one of the summer clerks to stay in his home and kind of watch the grass and just be around. It was down here very near the intersection of Sierra Madre and Huntington Drive. So by returning to Monte Vista Grove, we have returned to where we started in California 55 years ago. And all the streets around here feel very familiar. Lots of feeling of kind of returning home, being at Monte Vista Grove. I joined a private law firm, as Liz described. She was with one for 3 years. I spent 20 years in a private law firm, and I did mainly business work, corporate deals, stock offerings, bond offerings, mergers, acquisitions, that sort of thing. I was never a trial lawyer. The last 5 years with the firm, I had become managing partner. And this was an 85 lawyer firm growing to 135 lawyers over this 5-year period of time. And a lot was going on in the legal profession in those days, and it was a difficult time to be managing partner of this particular law firm. Everything went well the first couple of years, but then the fighting started over compensation. And I took on too much personal responsibility, pushed myself beyond my capabilities, and ended up burning myself out as a lawyer. Burnout can be a euphemism. Was it a mini breakdown? We could argue about what to call it, but I had to leave the law. And during my time as managing partner, I'd become a lot more interested in what makes people tick. So I'd been reading a lot of books about psychology, and I knew about a program at the local California School of Professional Psychology where I could learn more about psychology. And at that time, it seemed like kind of a port in a storm because life was very chaotic, a lot of change going on in our family. But one thing led to another. I got a master's degree and eventually a PhD in clinical psychology. I never did private practice. I did mainly public mental health. 5 years out in San Fernando Valley and Van Nuys at a community mental health center, working with chronic mentally ill adults, people with schizophrenia, severe personality disorders, OCD, etc. And the last public mental health work I did was up in the Bay Area in Martinez in a day program for developmentally disabled adults, people from age 21 through early 60s, most of whom lived in group homes, some with families. And they would come in for a day program, and we would try to love them through the day. Very gratifying work personally. Okay, that's the career. What have I left out?
Well, you have some current interests around the cosmos.
Oh.
And several of us have been blessed to have these really wonderful conversations with you about your perspectives on the nature of the creation of the universe and what all that means, and not just physically, but what that means spiritually. So tell us a little bit about where did that come from and what that means to you now, Tom?
I think it started when I was studying psychology. That would have been around 1990, early 90s, and have just kind of pursued it on my own since then. I've learned a great deal about the cosmos, the history of the universe, and am particularly thrilled actually to be in Pasadena right now because 100 years ago, 1923, 1924, Edwin Hubble was right up here at Mount Wilson doing his research that led to his announcement in early 1925 that the Milky Way is not all there is. There are other galaxies. And that, of course, has led to an explosion in our knowledge about the cosmos and the universe over the last 100 years. The Carnegie observatories here in Pasadena will be celebrating Hubble's achievements over the next 18 months or so. And here we are about to enter into another explosion because of the launch of the James Webb Space Telescope and a couple of other instruments that are out there. There's going to be another explosion in our knowledge of the cosmos. But I, over time, have tried to relate to it on a personal level, which is very difficult to do for things that are so far, far, far away and out in the cold outer space. So what I've started focusing on, instead of the things that are in the cosmos, I focus on the dynamics of the cosmos. Various things that are not visible with our eyes, but once you learn a little bit about them, you can relate to them. For example, one of the dynamics of the cosmos is that everything is moving. And here we sit quietly in this room, but inside of us, our hearts, our lungs, the blood flowing through our systems, digestive processes are moving constantly. And the same thing is happening to everything in the cosmos. If we were to count to 5, we would all move about a mile to the east because we're riding on a ball that's rotating. And that same ball is going towards the west at about 67,000 miles an hour. And we sit here totally oblivious to it. So I try to figure out ways to become aware of the Earth's rotation and movement. And there's a whole list of other dynamics that I focus on. And when I get in touch with those things, I feel connected to the cosmos. It's an awesome experience. And I think experiences of awe are spiritual. People can experience awe in a lot of different settings, but the way I do it is through the cosmos.
Well, we are absolutely thrilled that out of all the places you could be living right now, you've chosen to come and be a part of this community. And I'm sure that there are our friends here who want to interact some more. So comments, questions for Liz, for Judy, for Tom, from any of you who are gathered here in Marwick this afternoon. Dean?
Durff's, Liz told us about the shoulders, some of the shoulders she stands on. Who are some of the shoulders the two of you as individuals stand on?
Well, of course, they're my professors at Fuller. Mary Ann and John Thompson were beloved professors, and Ian Pitt Watson was also a beloved professor. I worked with him in the preaching department. And Gary Demarest, I worked with him in polity, and there are just many people from Fuller who were important to me in taking someone who really didn't know much about the Bible and teaching me a few things. I tried to learn as much as I could. But in terms of spirituality and spiritual formation and these practices that I've been talking about, Ben Campbell Johnson, who was at Columbia Seminary, was very important as a mentor to me, and someone who encouraged me that indeed we could experience the movement of the Holy Spirit and we could help other people see that and experience that. And I could say more about that, but I don't want to take too much time. Elizabeth Liebert at San Anselmo, Catholic nun, whose book on discernment, as far as I'm concerned, is the best thing. There are a lot of books now that are written about discernment, but Elizabeth Liebert has written the best. And I was fortunate enough to, in my training at San Anselmo, San Francisco Theological Seminary, I was able to work with her and know her. So those are just a couple of the people I would name. I think I should probably also say, you know, when I went back to church, Gary Demarest was at La Cañada, and he was an outstanding preacher. And I think along with Ian Pitt Watson, they probably taught me how to preach.
You each mentioned having children. Would you like to tell us about them?
I have 2 sons. My son Todd and his wife Nikki live with their 2 children who are 6 and 4 in Brooklyn, in the Park Slope neighborhood of Brooklyn, right near Prospect Park. Todd is an amazing sort of jack of all trades. He's been a musician, he's been an airline pilot, he is a great photographer and is currently the chief photo editor for a photography company in New York that covers all the art events and fashion events, and he did all the photo editing for the after Oscars party that Vanity Fair threw. So he can identify any of these stars that we've never heard of. But he's also a great father and does a lot of the primary parenting because he has a lot more flexibility. So it's wonderful to see both of my boys become parents themselves and become really good fathers and really hands-on parents. My younger son, Carter, and his wife, Sarah, and their son, Carrie, live in Santa Monica. So I get to see them regularly. And Carter works for the Natural Resources Defense Council, doing transportation policy and planning for the NRDC primarily in this region in the state. He regularly testifies on legislative matters in Sacramento, but around the country. So I'm very proud of both of my boys. And so yeah, 2 sons, 3 grandsons, not a girl anywhere.
And we have a granddaughter on the way. I'll maybe share a little bit of her. That's our daughter Jessica and her husband Rob. That will be their second child. Their first child, Pearson, is 5.5 and quite a handful, but a delightful young man. And they live in Manhattan Beach, and so we spend time with them. In fact, next weekend, after next weekend on Monday, just know that we will be exhausted and sleeping all day because we're going to take care of Pearson for the weekend. And our son Robert and his husband Bill were living in Seattle, had been there for 20 years together. And they are now in Palm Springs and testing out a year of life there to decide if that is where they want to move. I don't know, you want to say a word about their work?
Yes. Robert was a German scholar and then decided he did not want to be an academic, retooled himself and went to work for Microsoft in Seattle in a very esoteric field of computer work. He worked a number of years for Microsoft. He continues to do contract work for Microsoft and has done that for several years. And Bill works with a nonprofit in Seattle that supports in-home caregivers. So you have a family member who needs a caregiver, but they don't have the resources to hire one. Somebody in the family ends up being the caregiver. Aunt, uncle, husband, wife, etc. And this nonprofit provides in-home caregivers with resources, times for respite, etc. It really does a great job of supporting people who end up being in that position. And on Jessica currently is a full-time mother and housewife and pregnant woman.
Energy healer.
Well, yes.
Reiki
You'll have to explain that. You understand that more than I do. And her husband works in finance in downtown Los Angeles and has been quite successful.
Well, just that Jessica, in addition to several other careers that she's tried, is what is called a Reiki master, which is an energy healing ministry.
I have a question. I echo everyone's delight that the three of you are here, but I'm wondering if you would share just a little bit about what drew you here to Monte Vista Grove.
So I went to junior high school down the street, never knew this was here. My partner, Charles Svensson, is a retired now, but interim minister who served 24 different churches. He was serving the Westminster Westlake Village Church. And some of the parishioners there said, "You really need to meet Bob Boss." He was the founding minister of this church. So they organized for us to come out and have lunch with Bob and Carol. And we did that a few times. And Bob and Carol were so lovely and gracious, and we made this nice connection. Then I was walking around this campus saying, "This is really beautiful. I grew up right here, and I didn't know this existed. I wish that this was a place that the likes of me could come into." And this was before the rules had been changed to permit exceptions to be made for non-clergy to apply and be accepted. So, I thought, boy, if that was something available to me, I would sure jump on it. And then I found out just a few years ago, Betty Glick and I were colleagues at UCLA together in totally different departments, so we got to know each other. And she posted on Facebook that she was moving into Monte Vista Grove. And I made the comment to her, "Wait, are you getting in as an elder?" And she said, "Yes, I am. They changed the rules." And then Lynn knows this story, because Lynn then chimed in with the comment, "Liz, would you like me to send you an application?" And I started thinking about that and praying about that and wondering about whether that was, a good move for me. And a couple of months later, I contacted Lynn and said, "I really would like to have a conversation with you about that." So that's what started my journey back here.
Tom and I both knew that it was simply time to move into some type of communal living community. We had both had bouts with cancer and we were aging. And Tom really wanted to come back to Southern California. I wasn't quite so sure about that. Forgive me, but that's honest. And so, but we came back here to Southern California and looked around, and it was just clear that Monte Vista Grove was the place for us, and the idea of being able to have a cottage to live in. And the longer we've been here and the more of the stories that we've heard and meeting all of you has just confirmed that this was absolutely the right decision for us, and we're very thankful.
Well, I said at the beginning, and now it's confirmed at the end. We are delighted that you are colleagues, friends, and members of this community. And we look forward to living life with you for all the days that the Lord gives us. So let me just close us in a word of prayer. God, for Liz, for Judy, and for Tom, we are grateful that in your sovereign guiding of their lives, you've brought them to this place. And what a blessing they have been to us, not just for this hour, but for the days and months that we've already had a chance to live with them, and for many more to come. So thank you for bringing these friends to us. We are very, very grateful. In Christ's name, amen. Well, next week at 4 o'clock, please find your way over here to Marwick if you're on campus, or check in with us on the YouTube channel, because we're going to have Marcia Rude with us. Marcia is good friends with Rebecca and Dean Thompson. Marcia's a longtime member at Pasadena Presbyterian Church, and is the person who is responsible for the transition of Old Town to the way that it is now over a long period of time as she worked with the Pasadena, the city of Pasadena. And this is a story that we need to hear. For those of us who were here in the 1970s, which is a long time ago, we remember what Old Town was like. And there was no Apple store, there was no Tesla, there was no Peloton store. And there they are now with a variety of other of amenities there. So please come as we hear a story about a part of our own town and how it transitioned from the way it was to the way it is now through Marcia Rood. We'll see you next Thursday at 4 o'clock. Thanks for coming.